Welcome to the last and concluding session of the 7th World Policy Conference. I'm not sure everybody is here, but those who are in the room should not be punished for those who are not yet in the room. It's part of a democratic treatment. Usually, when you are the last one to speak in a panel, you tend to start your remarks by saying, everything has been said, but not by me. In the case of the concluding panel, it's slightly different. It is, in a way, like a puzzle. We are going to try to put the pieces of the puzzle that are going to glue the picture together and trying to make sense of all the elements we've gathered so far. Je vais commencer cette session en français parce que notre premier orateur va utiliser la langue de Molière. Je l'en félicite et l'en remercie. Mohamed Lachoubi est un professeur de sciences politiques, un membre de l'Académie royale d'Espagne, et il a exercé de nombreuses fonctions ministérielles en Algérie, son pays. Mohamed, I give you the floor, vous devez donner l'exemple. Vous êtes le premier orateur. Vous avez 8 minutes devant vous pour dresser la vision la plus globale possible. The floor is yours.
Je vous remercie. C'est effectivement un privilège assez terrible à relever parce que nous sommes en fin de session et les gens sont relativement fatigués et surtout après un repas. Mais je pense que c'est quand même une séance extrêmement intéressante et dans un premier temps, je voudrais que sur le plan méthodologique remercier les organisateurs. Les remercier non pas dans des remerciements courtois habituels, mais les remercier d'avoir initié un cadre de management extrêmement intelligent, mais surtout avec des profils différenciés. Alors en quoi c'est intéressant? Parce que assez souvent sur les questions que nous soulevons, elles sont plutôt définies, débattues dans des cadres ministériels ou dans des cadres institutionnels relativement restreints, et surtout cela influence la décision politique. Et là, ce type d'espaces ne sont pas encore un contrepoids, mais l'idée est extrêmement intéressante. Alors, elle vient dans un contexte, à mon sens, où globalement la production de la pensée politique s'est relativement amenuisé, réduit, et du coup, un espace pareil devient un défi pour l'avenir, un défi de ce qu'on aimerait voir dans les espaces de débat et de dialogue internationaux, mais cela prélude, à mon sens, d'une autre tendance. Ça, c'est le premier point méthodologique que je voulais évoquer. Le second point, c'est finalement, il y a eu de brillantes interventions, des choses extrêmement intéressantes, mais comment ensemble nous pourrions aller à ce que nous estimerions être les problématiques essentielles, comment tenter des lectures du monde qui vient, des mondes qui viennent, parce que je crois que l'enjeu est celui-là. Nous avons vu dans les ateliers, M. Trichet l'évoquait, M. Védrine, un ensemble de brillants orateurs, et peut-être qu'aussi, à mon sens, l'essentiel est là. Donc, mais en même temps, comment prendre la mesure des changements? Quelles sont les grandes tendances que nous estimons incontestables et qui vont influencer globalement les changements? Auparavant, j'aimerais, avec vous, suggérer un petit exercice d'introspection historique. Alors, nous avons évidemment les 2 guerres mondiales. Tout le monde s'accorde à dire quels ont été l'événement marquant du siècle dernier et qu'elles ont influencé fortement. Mais pour moi, j'aimerais soulever deux mouvements parallèles qui se sont faits. Évidemment, les deux guerres mondiales, évidemment, l'émergence des États-Unis, assis sur une maîtrise technologique, une redéfinition du monde, une modernisation de l'économie mondiale. Mais en même temps, le système des empires coloniaux s'effondre. 142 pays émergent et rentrent à l'ONU. 2/3 de la population planétaire apparaissent, exercent des droits. Et, à mon sens, véritable séisme occulté par les historiens ou pas suffisamment mis en valeur. Et pourtant, les acteurs de cette tendance lente, c'est vrai, sont ceux qui nous apparaissent clairement comme les acteurs du changement actuel. Évidemment, l'Inde, la Chine, le Brésil, la Corée. Et donc, ces deux mouvements parallèles, à mon sens, sont extrêmement intéressants à étudier. C'est un lent mouvement dont la lisibilité a été totalement brouillée par la guerre froide. Et maintenant, nous avons, prenant quelques petits exemples de ces éléments, de ces tendances en puisant dans les chiffres, prenons la Méditerranée. En 1950, les populations riveraines du Nord présentaient 2 fois plus en chiffres, en poids démographique, à peu près 66% sur. En 2025, c'est l'inversion totale. C'est les pays du Sud qui vont représenter donc 2 fois plus. Prenons des petits exemples assez rapides pour dire ce que sont un peu ces changements. L'Égypte et l'Algérie ont triplé leur population. L'Algérie est passée d'une espérance de vie de 52 ans à 75 ans. La population active féminine a triplé. La Chine, son espérance de vie est passée en 1945, était de 35 ans. Maintenant, en 2009, elle est de 72 ans. Et donc, on peut continuer à énoncer ces chiffres. Elle est devenue un géant du séquençage mondial. Aujourd'hui, officiellement, le FMI la déclare première économie mondiale, mais évidemment, elle est au 85e rang du PIB par tête d'habitant. Ça veut dire qu'il y a un déséquilibre de poids assez important et intéressant. La Corée fait entrer ses entreprises au top 10, qu'était la Corée il y a 30 ans. Qu'est-ce qu'elle est maintenant? Un des meilleurs systèmes, sinon le meilleur système au classement dans les systèmes universitaires ou les systèmes de recherche. La Chine, l'Inde, le Brésil s'introduisent dans les espaces de configuration des politiques mondiales, Kyoto, Doha, Copenhague. Sur le nucléaire, l'Iran argue qu'elle doit émerger, qu'elle veut maîtriser le nucléaire civil, tout ça dans la confusion. Et chose qui peut-être est passée inaperçue, à un moment, la Turquie et le Brésil se sont déclarés arbitres ou pouvant favoriser la négociation. Je suppose que là aussi, c'était une velléité d'un ensemble de pays de dire que le nucléaire civil est un élément incontournable du développement scientifique et des progrès. Ça veut dire que cet objectif n'est pas un objectif isolé, seul, et n'a pas qu'une dimension militaire. Première conclusion de cette première partie d'intervention, c'est que l'avenir est déjà présent. Il est déjà parmi nous. Alors très rapidement, le rapport démographique que vous avez tous pu lire dit qu'en 2050, nous serons 9 milliards. Que les populations des pays développés vont stagner à 1,2 milliard. Qu'en 2050, les plus de 60 ans vont représenter 2 milliards. Et que le rapport entre les inactifs et l'actif va passer de 11 à 25%. Cela va induire, comme le dit l'économiste de Société Générale Véronique Flores, un choc démographique terrible avec un déplacement spectaculaire des richesses. C'est-à-dire que ce taux faible de fécondité va induire une baisse du PIB par tête d'habitant de 9 à 23%. L'Asie va gagner 8 points, selon ses projections. Les États-Unis, 4 points à cause de sa politique dynamique d'immigration. L'Afrique, 1 point. Et l'Europe va perdre 12 points. Les BRICS, à eux seuls, en 2040, cumuleront 45% des seniors de la planète et donc seront demandeurs de main-d'œuvre. Bref, on assiste à un bouleversement terrible et surtout un bouleversement des hiérarchies. Avec première conclusion, retenez, une démonopolisation de la force de dissuasion. Une démonopolisation. Or, les stratégies, l'intégralité des stratégies ont été longtemps appuyées sur le monopole de la dissuasion nucléaire. Deuxième démonopolisation, la production technologique. Nous avons l'émergence de l'Asie, d'autres espaces, et du coup, nous nous retrouvons dans un espace gouvernance mondiale avec des éléments nouveaux. Et la crise est passée par là. Elle est venue frapper, elle est venue accélérer et mettre à nu un ensemble d'éléments d'insuffisance. Elle est venue mettre en évidence de graves distorsions et des contestations de modèles de développement, marée noire, Fukushima, immigration clandestine, chômage, famine, etc. Et surtout, nous interpeller sur des chantiers communs, la santé, le sida, donc Ebola. Alors, la tâche de remise en ordre de l'économie mondiale, prélude d'une crise longue, qui nécessite des responsabilités communes, qui nécessite objectivement, et non plus comme nous l'avons entendu dans le cadre de litiges, d'émotions, d'affrontements. C'est-à-dire que l'espace mondial objectif va devoir dicter une autre organisation, même si celle qui existe maintenant est en déphasage. Et le côté aggravant, c'est que nous sommes à des fins de cycle. Le modèle énergétique est saturé, le modèle agricole tourne le dos à l'écologie, il est gaspilleur d'eau, l'insécurité alimentaire est bien installée dans certaines régions avec la guerre de la faim, les modèles alimentaires sont contestés avec les OGM, la gestion des ressources en eau va devoir faire face à de graves pénuries. Donc, c'est l'ensemble de ces cycles qu'il faudra renouveler. Or, leur renouvellement va nécessiter des dépenses publiques extrêmement importantes. Je lisais il y a quelques jours que les Allemands projetaient plus de 400 milliards sur un certain nombre de questions. Cela veut dire qu'il y a d'un côté l'endettement, il y a de l'autre côté, pour la modernisation et un nouveau process mondial, des dépenses à effectuer et une politique budgétaire totalement différente de celle que nous écoutons en ce moment. Alors, dès lors, il nous faudra, pour faire face, donc, créer de nouvelles solidarités, de nouvelles démarches. Or, chaque fois qu'on évoque la mondialisation, il y a, si vous voulez, deux angoisses qui apparaissent. La première liée à la guerre mondiale, la seconde liée, selon certains, au cynisme de la relation internationale, qui est plus basée sur la compétition et la recherche de prééminence, plutôt que de faire face à tout ce que nous venons d'évoquer en termes de nouvelles organisations. La conclusion, il nous faudra réinventer le monde, il nous faudra définir de nouvelles démarches. Pour ma part, je pense que vous êtes d'accord, cet espace, Prélude, est un espace extrêmement intéressant qui pourra nous permettre de projeter l'avenir.
Merci beaucoup. We will switch back to English and we'll move to Professor Jeffrey Frieden, who is Professor of Government at Harvard University.
Thank you. Our theme for the last 3 days has been global governance, and out of respect for that theme, I want to present some observations about the topic of global governance, both as it's been discussed here and more generally. And I will sound 3 notes. First, a note of skepticism, then a note of realism, and finally, a note of guarded optimism. Let me start with a note of skepticism. Global governance is very often invoked as a sort of magic wand, or I suppose a deus ex machina, descending, I guess, from Geneva, I suppose, that will force good policies on governments that somehow inexplicably have not undertaken them. But in fact, the normative argument for global governance is quite strictly circumscribed. Governance typically would be defined as supplying government-like functions, and global governance, therefore, is supplying government-like functions at a supranational, above-national level. Global governance in this context is only really justified if there are global public goods that cannot be supplied by national governments. There are plenty of such global public goods. Public health might be one, the environment, climate change, or dealing with climate change. But these are circumscribed. Global governance, or the invocation of global governance, doesn't serve as a justification for dealing with our frustration with national governments by trying to bump something up to the international level. Just because national governments cannot or will not act on certain issues, or at least adequately in our view, to deal with, say, macroeconomic instability or the situation in the Middle East, it doesn't really help to call upon global governance as a solution. If governments won't act on their own, they're very unlikely to delegate these important policies to some non-existent international government or global governance. So I would be very careful about prescribing global governance as a solution for all of our problems. Most issues, in most countries, most of the time, can be adequately confronted by national governments. Even if they're not, they can be adequately confronted by national governments. That brings me to a note of realism. I think one of the reasons that people in frustration turn to ideas of global governance is that we remain mired in the most serious economic crisis since the 1930s, and it is therefore not surprising that most national political economies are more or less completely absorbed in dealing with their very, very difficult domestic, social, economic, and political conditions. Governments everywhere have been driven inward in trying to resolve the domestic implications of the crisis that has affected all of us. So the conditions are not really propitious for major nations to undertake significant international initiatives, especially if those initiatives draw them away from confronting their domestic concerns, unless those international initiatives can be found to be directly related to their domestic concerns. So I don't see this as an argument for doing nothing. I see it as an argument for scaling back our ambitions, for realism, for trying to choose topics and approaches that governments will actually undertake given the circumstances and constraints that they face. Some might regard this as pessimistic, but I would remind you that after all, a pessimist is just a well-informed optimist. Let me end on a note of guarded optimism in this context. Despite the national self-absorption of many of our governments, I think that in fact, in the context of the crisis, there have been some striking examples of successful international cooperation, and even perhaps of the beginnings of some global governance. Precisely because the situation in some realms was so dire, there have in fact been attempts at providing a global response to some of the problems that we face. The most striking to me, perhaps because it is my own area of expertise, but I think it is of more general interest as well, has been the extraordinary degree of cooperation among national monetary and financial authorities in the aftermath of September, October 2008, on monetary policy, on financial regulation. I think that few of us, including those of us who are specialists in the area, would have anticipated the degree of cooperation that has ensued after the crisis hit. So perhaps the threat, which was very real 7 years ago, of a new Great Depression, like the threat of imminent execution, concentrated the minds of policymakers and led to international cooperation. It was necessary. No one government could possibly have confronted the global financial crisis effectively, and it was forthcoming. So inasmuch as we are likely to face similarly pressing international problems, this may well be the cause of optimism. Confronted with a serious problem that all governments had to deal with, there was, in fact, a tendency for governments to step to the plate, as we would say, and to work together quite effectively in the monetary and financial realm. So some cause for optimism, albeit guarded. So in conclusion, I would suggest that we be skeptical of the excessive invocation of global governance as a cure for what ails us, as a solution to intractable international problems. I would suggest that we be realistic about the ability of national governments to overcome the national self-absorption that's natural in a crisis like this, and to embark on major new international initiatives. But I would be guardedly optimistic, as there have in fact been some notable and important successes in both national policies and international cooperation. So to me, the implication is that our principal efforts in these troubled times should, as they usually should be to encourage our national governments to pursue better policies. And upon this basis, I think we can perhaps look forward to more effective international cooperation and perhaps even more global governance.
Thank you very much. Now we move from Harvard University to Beijing University with Professor Liu Chen, who has PowerPoint to show us, will be the first and only person in this panel.
I take the honor. Thank you, Dominic. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Bonjour. 안녕하세요. konbanwa. 下午好. At the three-day conference, issues concerning globalization and the future and thus were discussed and reflections shared. Among them, China is now home to the most important and interesting discussions. Given that China's role for future is positively throbbing with debate, I'd like to talk about China Goes Global, which is my research area. The reform and opening up launched in year 1978. It has been seen as the start of China Goes Global, and it was described as a spring. However, China's determination and efforts made to open up for the world took a very long period of time. Take 新闻联播, a leading daily TV news program on prime time on CCTV, China Central Television, as an example. In the first decade of a three-decade reform and opening up, the total international news broadcasted by 新闻联播 was 14 pieces altogether, and 13 of them were bad news, such as bombing, coup d'etat, and so on. Also, the policy decisions on China Goes Global are made not easily in China. Instead, it has been confronting series of arguments and doubts. This is my historical analysis of the 8 third plenary sessions of the Central Committee of China since 1978. Normally, the Chinese government lays policy objectives at the third plenary session. You can see in year 1998, when press reform in China was confronting challenge and serious problems, opening up didn't appear in the communique of that year. Well, China has finally been decided to China Goes Global, continue China Goes Global. For instance, the use of term soft power. Soft power is interpreted in China as for that going global successfully. It first appeared in China on the mainstream media in China in year 2001. Well, you can see it has been increasingly discussed and mentioned in China. It indicates that China is truly concerned about the involvement and engagement in the world. Also, China has been actively involved in international affairs. Also, China is willing to make more contributions. And good intention and efforts can be seen by the world. On PRC's 60th anniversary, Time wrote, "It has been a long and winding and sometimes tragic road, but on its 60th anniversary, the People's Republic stands tall." In all, China Goes Global has been a long and winding road, but direction now is clear. It's good for future, both for China and the world, in particular in the globalized context. And the scope for cooperation is unlimited. But we need wisdom, we need strategy, and we need belief. For all of these, we come here and we have WPC. Merci, thank you. Cosmo Asamida, arigatou gozaimasu, and shukran. 谢谢大家.
Thank you very much. We'll see whether the Japanese are as enthusiastic about China than the Chinese are about themselves. And we'll give the floor to Kuni Miyake, who is the research director of the Cannon Institute for Global Studies.
Thank you. Dominique, I'd like to thank every one of you, especially, I think you made a big mistake in inviting me because I'm not always the right person to talk about this, but I do my best to share with you how I see the world. You know, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an economist, I'm not the prophet, and I'm not divine. So what I'm going to tell you is what I believe in as what's going on in this part of the world, or in this world as a general. I think what the most important element is the rise of nationalism on the earth. Nationalism is back, and I think we should focus on how to control it, because the Russian bear is back in Europe. And, you know, when I see the world, this is the fourth biggest power shift, which started maybe in the late 18th century when the Industrial Revolution started and Pax Britannica started. Then there was a challenger, the end of the 19th century. And then two challengers survived, Americans and Russians, and they started the Cold War. Then this is the fourth biggest power shift on the earth since the 18th century. So the Cold War, in a sense, frozen, contained the nationalism of unhealthy, potentially violent nationalisms in Europe and elsewhere. And unfortunately, the event in Crimea in 2014, this year, symbolizes the end of the post-Cold War era. Unfortunately, bears are back, dragons are back, and unfortunately, we have to deal with it. What Russia is doing on the ground in Europe is similar to what our neighbors are doing on the waters in East Asia. What they are trying, possibly, is to change the status quo by force. We cannot tolerate that. Japan is not a young nation anymore. We are aging, and we want to age gracefully. And it was already 70 years ago, but now we are a status quo power. We don't want to change the status quo. We are happy with the status quo. But unfortunately, if some elements, either in the East or the West, most notably former empires strike back in our part of the world and in the European part of the world. So my point is that how to deal with the rise of nationalism. When I was in London, for example, just a few months ago, they were talking about the independence of what? Scotland? Are you kidding? No, they were serious. It's a one aspect of this Scottish nationalism. Or the Brits were talking about leaving EU. This is another example of British nationalism. So it's everywhere, in France, in Germany, and of course, even in my country. I don't deny that. However, I think it's time for us, for Europeans, which which are also status quo powers, not the status quo changing powers. EU, maybe NATO, US, Japan, and maybe many Southeast Asian countries. I don't want to name further, but those like-minded countries has to work together and discuss the means to control nationalism. And my answer to that question is fairly simple. That's democracy. Yes, we have some right-wingers in my country. I don't deny that. But if you go to Europe, you have more votes from right-wingers. In the European Parliament election in May, I was surprised because they have much more right-wingers votes in the parliament than in Japan. So I think, but still I'm confident that democracy and universal values will prevent that from going too far. I think with democracy and universal values, we can control the nationalism, which is potentially unhealthy, violent, and dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We continue our tour around the globe, and we arrive in India with Toby Simon, who is the founder and chairman of the Synergia Foundation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dominic. I must thank all of you for having the patience on an afternoon at this time to listen. Let me just try to share a few of my thoughts. The discussions that we had in the last 3 days rightfully focused on the issues of key global governance in North Asia, Northeast Asia, Eurasia, Europe, and the Americas. With the permission of the chair, I will take about 8 minutes to expand the construct and speak about a smaller part of the world, which houses about 1.8 billion people and constitutes 40% of the Asian population. A region comprising Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and Maldives. So why is this important? In a globalized and wired world, strategic issues that affect about 2 billion people from very diverse backgrounds, both cultural and religious, and home to two of the largest religions, Buddhism and Hinduism, would naturally affect the region and globe. In addition, we had a very strong footprint of Islam for more than 1,000 years. Going forward, you have another important vector, that the center of gravity of the internet and the cyber is moving to Asia. In about the next 10, 15 years, there would be more number of internet users in India and China than you put the rest of the world together. I would like to focus on two issues, which I believe is core to global governance these days. The first one is on human security, meaning protecting the fundamental life and value of the individual. If we are to look at the 10 threats which John Manley yesterday alluded to from a report of the World Economic Forum as the 10 threats for 2015, it's very interesting. If you see, it's again, I will read it once more. It's deepening income inequality, jobless growth, lack of leadership, rising geostrategic competition, weakening of democracy, pollution, severe weather events, increasing nationalism, water wars, and health. If you say more than 70% of it has to do with the security of the individual, it's no more territorial issues. It's about the individual. All these challenges and threats that has been listed in 2015 are those that South Asia has been facing for the last 15 to 20 years. I mean, since 2000, this has been some of the biggest issues we have. Now, look at the interconnectedness between these issues. I would take logging, which is a basic industry in this part of the world, as an example. Logging along the Burma Road. You know, what does happen? It's basically loss of forest cover, which affects watersheds, which cause flooding later. Drugs, they're smuggled in the logs. HIV and AIDS, because truck drivers visit prostitutes while traveling. Malaria and other communicable diseases, which are spread during logging and deforestation. Industrial pollution. Organized crime associated with mining along the roads. And military concerns. Logging roads provide connectivity, which is a problem in most border areas. I mean, and this is the connect. It's one event, but if you look at it, it has got geopolitical impact. For example, drugs. Today, drugs is the single largest threat to organized, to national security for a number of countries. And the second point I would like to focus is on the need to build trust politics, which was spoken by the South Korean President, Madam Park. Nowhere is this more needed than in South Asia. If you look at the inter-trade relationship in Asia, it goes about 56 to 60%. But in South Asia, it is less than 5%. And the prime reason is the issue that was spoken about yesterday, the conflict in trade and politics. And look at the other issues that are coming by, which can have global impact. Number one is Afghanistan. Stabilizing Afghanistan should be in the immediate interest of all, because Afghanistan has been the cradle of a large number of conflicts since Alexander invaded it in 321 BC. The second is the Persian Gulf, Persian and the Middle East region. Regional stability in this region is extremely important, and the success of moderate regimes is extremely important to ensure that there is no clash of civilization that has been propounded by a number of people. I mean, you look at events in Syria unfolding in Bombay, where just day before yesterday, we had 5 young engineers. I mean, they didn't even tell their parents. They just went there. They were all bright children, playing sport, never had a chance of meeting anybody religious in India, but they just left. Saw something in the internet that disturbed them, and they went to Iraq, and then went into Syria. Look at moving onwards into Philippines, into Indonesia, into Malaysia. I mean, there are plenty of incidents, and unless we are able to look at it from a larger perspective, trying to sort of, plugging one leak, you would open up another flashpoint. Look at the Sino-Indo relationship. Most of the people are talking about the border issues, but we have an even bigger issue in the Indo-Chinese problem, which is the damming of the Brahmaputra River, which is the source of water for India and Bangladesh. So over the last 5 or 8 years, the Chinese have been damming those rivers at a very high level, which can cause flooding in this part. So that could be a huge issue, which can affect the entire Asian region. From a climate change perspective, it is estimated that by 2050, more than 8 of the big cities in Asia wouldn't exist, including Mumbai, Colombo, Maldives, Bangladesh, you name Karachi, they may not be there because of global warming and rising of waters. What about healthcare? Due to global warming, we have a big issue. Most of the diseases that were proprietary to the southern hemisphere is moving into the northern hemisphere. Look at TB and malaria. You have strange, multi-resistant diseases moving into these countries, which people are finding extremely difficult to counter. So let me conclude by saying that challenges that seem very endemic to a region can have huge geopolitical impact, and I just wanted to share that this is something that we should not overlook. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we do a little detour to Latin America before ending in Asia, thanks to an old friend of the WPC, Carlos Perez Verdia, who is the head of the private office of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you for having me back. I had a lot of fun in this panel last year. It's a bit of a kitchen sink panel. Let's throw everything in. And I will take advantage of that to talk about Latin America and use 3 of the conference themes to do so. So starting with global security, we have in Latin America no significant religious, ethnical, or cultural rivalries, no significant border disputes, So we are pretty much absent from this debate of spheres of influence. We are not an external or a global threat to geopolitics, but it is interesting that we are absent, given that in most of the panels that we have had over the past 3 days, the US has been mentioned in almost every single one of them. And of course, at the doorstep of the US are 500 million people that live in Latin America. Joseph Nye mentioned yesterday that the US is in a period of retrenchment, was the word I believe he used, talking about these cyclical engagement of the US in geopolitics. So the question I was asking myself is if this is evident in Latin America. And I'm not sure I would use retrenchment as the word. In some ways, it's an welcome absence of being a protagonist, especially in those areas where the US is not necessarily welcome or being asked to be present. But that does not mean it's not engaged, especially bilaterally, and in those topics where it thinks it can do, or it's mostly interested in being. Security, for sure, with Mexico. Border management is one example. Migration is another one. We saw during the spring a big crisis of childhood migration, and the US being working very closely with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Interestingly, I think the most significant policy action that the US has taken for relations with the continent is actually a domestic policy, and it has to do, of course, with the executive action by President Obama on immigration, and the implications this will have are humongous. Just for Mexico, there will be 4 million Mexican immigrants to the US that will be able, for the first time, to have a driving license. They will be able to travel, to get a job, to have access to healthcare. We're talking about mostly the parents of US citizens. So this will, of course, continue to shape the face of the US, the ethnic face of the US, with a huge boon for empowerment of the Latino population, which is quickly on its way to becoming 1/3 of US population. The second topic of the conference that I will draw some inspiration from is growth and inequality debate, which I thought was fascinating. Here I'm maybe a little bit less optimistic than last year, where we had many of the Latin American countries doing a lot of the structural reforms that they knew they had to do. And my less optimism comes from two sources. One is a short-term risk, and Jeffrey, you talked about that yesterday, these huge capital flows. I think Latin America during the crisis proved that it was mostly, I don't want to say absolutely resilient, but we are not facing the Latin America that we did in the 80s or the 90s, but perhaps what's most worrying is still the dependence of some fiscal dependence on some countries on resources from commodities. Mexico, for example, 1/3 of its fiscal budget is still oil dependent. Colombia is 1/4, Ecuador is much higher than that. But perhaps more worryingly has to do with midterm prospects for growth. I think it was, Dominique and Thierry, we have to congratulate you for having the conference here. It was a welcome aspect of the conference to have our Korean friends' conviction on the benefits of markets for the economy and for the ultimate goal of development. To be honest, sometimes the debates over the past few years since the crisis, I think the pendulum has swung completely the other way, and we have, in some ways, vilified markets. In Latin America, nonetheless, and even though we see examples such as South Korea, the debate is still very much alive. There is a lack of conviction and trust in market economies in some places. So I think we are caught in what the OECD has called the middle income territory. We have not made the transition to an economy of knowledge. So if you compare, for example, surveys on the need or the difficulties of finding qualified work, 15% of companies in East Asia, according to the OECD, will tell you that they cannot find qualified work. The figure is 40% in Latin America. That's a huge difference. There are other statistics. Research and development firms in Korea, again using our host as an example, invest about 3.5% to 4% of their income in research and development. In Latin America, the highest country, Brazil, is less than 1%. Patents, Korea has about 250 patents per million inhabitants. Latin America, the highest country is 2.5. That's Chile. That's 1% of what's here in Korea. So that, I think, is a source of worry. I could, of course, and let me quote some of the figures on starting a business for what the difference in starting a business in Korea or in Latin America. The Ease of Doing Business Index for the World Bank has the Pacific Alliance countries, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia, in the 30s to the 40s range. But then we have a big chunk of countries, very significant countries, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and Venezuela, all of them being above number 120. So if we look, South Korea, number 5. South Korea takes 3 procedures to start a business. Mexico, it's 6, double than that. Venezuela, the last one on the list, it's 17. Time to get electricity. In South Korea, it's 18 days to get electricity for a new business. In Mexico, it's 2.5 months. For Venezuela, it's half a year, and I could go on. Let me move on to the last.
On your conclusion.
On my conclusion, governance. That's the largest challenge for Latin America. We have both global opportunities, like the ones mentioned by Minister Yoon yesterday on MICTA, but we have also huge local challenges. And here, Dominique, as my conclusion, I will use what you summed up yesterday as saying that the miracle in Asia and not in the Middle East is the question of governance. You mentioned the absence of the rule of law, human rights violations as unacceptable. And I would have to say that is still very much the case in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, last but not least, we are ending with Malaysia and Michael Yeo, who is the founder and CEO of Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute.
Thank you, Chair. I would focus my remarks primarily on the ASEAN region of Southeast Asia. I think the last 2 days we have heard a lot about this region, China, Japan, Korea, but very little on Southeast Asia. I believe some of the issues and challenges of governance that we have in Southeast Asia are quite universal and quite common with the rest of the countries. Let me just make perhaps 5 quick points. Firstly, I would like to argue, and I think this is an argument that many have put forward, that the center of gravity for the world economy has shifted to Asia and will increasingly do so. A recent study has shown that by 2030, 10 out of the 50 biggest economies will come from Asia, and out of that, 5 of the top 10 will be from Asia. That's China, India, Japan, Korea, and Indonesia. The challenge that these countries would face would be the challenge of managing success and managing sustainable growth. My second point I would like to make, Chair, is the U.S. pivot to Asia, or the rebalance to Asia, is very much focused more on Southeast Asia. I argue this because for a long time, the U.S. has already been engaged with Japan and Korea, but have had a benign neglect on Southeast Asia. And I think this is perhaps manifested in the fact that President Obama has visited Southeast Asia twice this year in April and November. And this is quite unprecedented for a US president to travel to Southeast Asia twice within 6 months. And I think the president's visit to Southeast Asia has pushed the envelope further on human rights, on democracy, and good governance. And I think these are issues which are increasingly becoming more important for our Southeast Asian countries. Another point, China, that I'd like to share very briefly is China in Southeast Asia. Is it a threat or an opportunity? I would argue that China represents a huge, big opportunity for the countries of Southeast Asia. China is today the biggest trade partner of ASEAN and all of the 10 countries in ASEAN. Bilateral trade has increased double-digit between China and ASEAN. And the recent visit of the Chinese president and premier to Southeast Asia have made it clear that China would want to elevate its relations with Southeast Asia to a comprehensive strategic partnership. The Premier of China has announced last month at the ASEAN Summit in Naypyidaw that China will sign a new treaty of friendship with ASEAN to overcome some of the challenges and issues of the South China Sea. Some people argue that the South China Sea issue can be a threat to the stability of the region. I tend to think that this challenge can be resolved through peaceful negotiation and the adoption of a new code of conduct that is now being negotiated between the ASEAN countries and China. ASEAN as a whole is on the threshold of a new era, with the ASEAN Economic Community due to become a reality next year. ASEAN has a market of 600 million people with a growing middle class of over 100 million and a very young population, a majority of the population below 40 years of age. Collectively, ASEAN with a combined GDP of US 2.4 trillion can be the world's 7th biggest economy. To drive growth in ASEAN, connectivity and consumption remain key drivers, and the ASEAN countries have adopted a master plan of connectivity that will further strengthen regional integration. And then private consumption will continue to be a key driver of growth in the ASEAN countries. I think Korea has recognized the importance of ASEAN, and tomorrow President Park has invited the presidents and prime ministers of all the 10 ASEAN countries to meet in Busan to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Korea-ASEAN relations. I'd like to also argue that going forward, ASEAN needs to focus more on what I would classify as the 4 E's and 4 I's in terms of governance. Firstly, economic governance. There is a growing debate between free market economy and the role of governments in business in many of the ASEAN countries. Secondly, education and human capital development to close the skills gap in ASEAN. Thirdly, the challenge of employment and job creation, because some of our countries are going through a new phenomenon of jobless growth. And fourthly, environmental sustainability, climate change and pollution. At the same time, ASEAN needs more of the 4 I's, and these are investments, inclusive growth, infrastructure, and innovation. The immediate challenge facing ASEAN in the short term are what can be classified as the 4 C's: the cost of living, the impact on the poor, commodity prices. Falling commodity prices has a big impact on ASEAN, being major commodity exporters, rubber, palm oil, and oil as well. Consumption, private demand could be slowing, and climate change, the need to better manage natural disasters. So in conclusion, Chair, I think Southeast Asia will continue to play a key role in the regional architecture for Asia, and hopefully we would become a middle power in years to come. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all. Thanks to your discipline, spontaneous or nearly spontaneous. We have nearly 40 minutes in front of us to discuss what you've been saying. This is the first time the WPC has been to Asia. And of course, it has physical consequences on the bodies of European travelers. But what we lost in sleep, we gained tremendously in optimism. I think we arrive in a country booming with energy, guarded optimism in a continent that is carried by that sense of hope. Of course, not everything is perfect. There is the rise of nationalism, or Japanese participant went very far in comparing the Chinese at sea with the Russian on the ground. And I think it is a very strong sentence, which will remain with us. But at the same time, if we compare the debates that are taking place here within ASEAN between Korean and Chinese, in spite of the past, there's a huge difference between the nature of the debate in Asia and the nature of the debates in the Middle East, or for that matter, in a less dramatic way, in Europe. And if there is a place that could come closer to global governance and the ideal which Jeremy Frieden alluded to, it might be in Asia. In some ways, I would make a very daring comparison between Korea and Europe. Korea is caught between China on the one hand, and in some ways Japan on the other. It has a long historical tradition, a long and legitimately proud civilization, but it knows that around itself there are bigger actors. In some ways, Europe has to realize that she is now the inheritor of a great tradition, but she's caught also between the traditional United States and the new China. And we are also in a process of adjustment. Mohamed, you told us, very rightly so, in your introduction, that the world had changed dramatically and that we had to face to the new realities of this coming world. But we were told after your presentation that though the world had changed, everything had changed and nothing had changed, i.e. That the nationalism, the identity quest was even stronger today as a result of globalization. This is what we have been discussing in Asia, the tension between the changes brought about by globalization, but leading in identity terms to fragmentation and to identity quest. How do we adjust to these contradictions? I think this was what, as Europeans, we perceived by coming to Asia. And it is, I find, very symbolic that apart from the moderator, who should be saying nothing and just give the floor, there was no European on the panel. And in the last discussion with Robert Gates, the word Europe never came about. There was never a question about what he thought what he had been thinking, what he would think in the future of the European Union, as if we were something of the past and not something of the present or of the future. I think it's wrong, but this lesson of modesty is badly needed when we come to Asia. I've spoken much too long. This is now the time for me to give you the floor, and I'm waiting for the change of the light to see who wants to ask the question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank the last speaker, Michael Yeo, for bringing into this debate a very important and new subject, Southeast Asia. As you know, Southeast Asia is an ancient crossroads of exchanges, Eurasian exchanges, trade and exchanges of all sorts. And still today, 30% of world trade, not just between Europe and Asia, pass through there, including 80% of China's crude oil supplies that pass through the Strait of Malacca. In recent years, we've heard about tensions in this area, low-level tensions, deliberately kept at a sub-military level, confrontations between patrol crafts and exploration platforms and fishing vessels involving China, Vietnam, the Philippines. And several rationales for this have increasingly become clear. The Secretary Gates this morning mentioned the Chinese challenge to the US naval presence in the Pacific. And there's also the reports of a very high Chinese estimate of the resources in natural gas and oil in this area, which are very significant, which would explain that this is a strategic interest. What I want to bring in here is a question in terms of global governance. This region poses a lot of questions, opportunities, because there's much integration going on at the national and regional level, new institutions being formed around ASEAN and so forth. But there's also a lot of challenges to the existing order. And I'm thinking especially of maritime borders and also airspace borders, involving also Japan, not just Southeast Asia, but the East China Sea as well. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the existing international conventions on these type of borders are becoming irrelevant in the face of that new challenge. Mr. Yeo mentioned that there's a discussion going on about good conduct among ASEAN countries in that area. But I wonder, is that enough? Because it clearly concerns also the United States, Taiwan, Japan, other nations. So this is my question to the panel. What do we have as prospects for creating instruments for regulating these kind of problems, which to this date have been, as I said, deliberately kept at a very low level, but which are in danger of becoming more serious? I don't know if Professor Frieden has maybe an answer to this question.
Michael, I think if you want maybe to be the first one to tackle the issue, since you were the one to raise the ASEAN problem, please.
Yeah, Chairman. 1 year ago, I would have been very pessimistic about the situation. 1 year ago, we see large Chinese presence in Southeast Asia outside the waters of Vietnam and the Philippines. Today, after the recent East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Plus 3 Summit in Naypyidaw, I have become a little bit more optimistic. I think at that dialogue and at various other engagement that the ASEAN countries have had with China over the last 1 year, the Chinese leadership has slowly recognized the importance of not further pushing the envelope. Premier Li Keqiang has announced in Naypyidaw that China will adopt a two-track policy, one of direct peaceful negotiation with the affected countries, and two, to comply with the code of conduct that ASEAN is developing. And the code of conduct is not just between ASEAN and China, but with all other players who have an interest in the South China Sea. That includes the US, includes Japan, and all other countries. I'm optimistic that from the dialogue process last month in Naypyidaw, we are getting closer to an agreement on the code of conduct for the South China Sea.
Jeffrey, you want to add something?
Not very much. I think this is certainly outside of my particular area of expertise, but I guess I would say that what we observe in Asia generally not on the economic front, which we could talk about, but on the geopolitical front, is, I think, tensions associated with really changing power balances. The rise of China, of course, accompanied by the rise of India, the role of Russia, which has changed dramatically, and that of the United States, which is reassessing its position in Asia, as Dr. Gates said. And I think it's natural for there to be a great deal of uncertainty about how exactly this new power structure will look. I think the jury is still out. It's not entirely clear to me what any of the strategies of major powers in the area are, and I think we have to wait and see where things lead us. It's, as I say, I would like to hear from those who actually know more than I do about the region, what they anticipate.
We'll give the floor precisely to a member of the region, Kuni.
Yes, very short. I'm not as optimistic as Mr. Yo, but of course try to be as optimistic as possible. But I've been following Chinese foreign policy for the past 15 years. My conclusion is that sometimes they are very tactically soft and successful, but sometimes they are terribly bad in strategy. But in this case, my reading is that China's sort of a high-hand, assertive policy for the past several years didn't bear fruit, and they really finally realized that. So in Beijing, in Naypyidaw, and in G20, their position has softened tremendously, and I hope that this is going to be their strategic decision. But my conclusion is it is not. It is still a tactical decision, and they may change again. So we have to carefully monitor that, as long as, although the current position is much, much better, and I'm much more optimistic than before. Thank you.
If I may add to your point, after those 3 days in Seoul, I have the feeling most Asians tend to look at China as a more pragmatic country, let's say, than Russia in Europe, and that they are less worried about the possible attitude of China than Europeans would be about the potential development of Russian policy in Europe, with clearly the exception of the Japanese, who tend to be more European in the sense of looking at than the Korean or those who spoke today.
Well, that's a very fair observation. I know how some people in this room probably concerned about Putin in Ukraine, and because Putin is so successful, quite good. I'm amazed. It's beautifully done, and you cannot use force. And Putin is achieving his goal. So that's a soft power approach. And in a sense, I have been witnessing something similar as well, sometimes, not always. But I'm not alarming, but I'm just telling you my gut feeling. And their long-term strategic objective is basically kick the Americans out of this area.
Well, I think those who are looking at the stock market, the state of the ruble and the price of oil and gas would probably be less enthusiastic about the results brought about by Putin's action. But let's go back to the room, the audience.
May I speak French?
Absolument.
J'étais très heureux cet après-midi de voir que je n'étais pas le seul Sud-Américain dans la salle. J'ai trouvé que, à part le vin qui était chilien et la musique qui était brésilienne, ce dont je me félicite, l'Amérique latine était assez absente ces derniers jours et je me suis demandé si c'était en raison de sa totale irrelevance géopolitique. Je voudrais simplement souligner 2 points que je perçois quotidiennement dans ma vie professionnelle. Je travaille dans l'agriculture au Brésil et qui me semble justifier une meilleure incorporation de l'Amérique du Sud, en tout cas, je connais très peu le Mexique, dans les prochains débats. Je ne crois pas que l'Amérique du Sud soit une terre aussi tranquille que l'on puisse imaginer. Nous avons fait le calcul en 2013, nous avons eu plus de morts dans la périphérie de São Paulo que dans la même période sur un mois durant la guerre de Syrie, pour d'autres raisons évidemment, mais la violence est là. Et la violence, dans une grande ville comme São Paulo, est principalement liée à la consommation, au trafic et à la production de narcoproduits. L'Amérique latine est le centre économique et géopolitique de l'économie mondiale des drogues. Je pense que c'est un sujet très significatif du point de vue de l'organisation et de la gestion future du monde. Et de ce point de vue-là, le débat latino-américain mérite d'être réintégré. Je visite souvent des propriétés agricoles dans le centre du Brésil. On me dit, si demain les prix du soja que payent les Chinois ne sont pas aussi avantageux, on passera peut-être à d'autres cultures sur notre échelle. J'ajoute un dernier point. Jamais le sort économique de l'Amérique du Sud n'a été autant lié à la croissance asiatique. Nous sommes devenus les grands fournisseurs de matières premières. Nous sommes devenus les fournisseurs d'une bonne partie de l'alimentation de la Chine. Et donc cet aspect-là aussi est une raison pour laquelle nous devrions réintégrer l'Amérique du Sud dans le débat. S'il y a des commentaires de la part des panélistes, je serais très intéressé.
Carlos, would you like to answer? Just to say that there was a debate yesterday in Santiago de Chile, organized by the BBC, on the issue of the legalization of drug or not. And the former president of Chile was part of the debate.
Yes, thank you. And more than answer, I think I would agree completely with the comments, especially the call for making the WPC include Latin America. I think the next few years will be especially important in a lot of the subjects the gentleman touched on, violence and drugs, of course, leading up to the 2016 UN conference on drugs. Will be interesting. The link to Asian growth, I agree, not just for the traditional partners or commodity exporters, but also we see, especially with Japan as a long-term partner of the region, Korea. In Mexico, there are more than 1,600 South Korean companies that have invested in Mexico, and now China. I say, beyond the commodity exporters. So that's a huge opportunity to talk about that.
Thank you. I have 2 requests for answer. Mohamed en français and Jeffrey in English.
Oui, en fait, on pourrait avoir le sentiment que ces débats ne seraient que pure rhétorique, mais en réalité, à y regarder de plus près, nous avons maintenant 2 tendances. Celle extrêmement pessimiste, qui dit que l'espace des litiges, des conflits, des affrontements sont là, qui globalement pourrait même dire on n'a pas besoin de la multilatéralité, la gouvernance serait un deus ex machina, et qu'il n'y a pas d'instrument souple, que l'humanité n'a pas devant elle des défis pour gérer les espaces communs, parce que globalement on pourrait. Et les autres qui disent attention, juste après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, l'histoire démontre qu'on a créé Bretton Woods, qu'on a créé des instruments multilatéraux, qu'on a créé des espaces de compromis qui ont donné d'excellents résultats jusqu'à un certain moment, et que maintenant peut-être que nous arrivons à la limite, qu'il y a une multiplicité des acteurs, et on l'a entendu, ils sont de plus en plus importants, et ils sont de poids. Mais Le débat est presque, j'allais dire, d'éthique, mais de réalité politique, et d'ailleurs, les deux sont là. L'émergence des nouvelles puissances, la Chine, tout le monde s'interroge sur son attitude. Va-t-elle venir concourir dans l'espace des confrontations, des litiges et de la dissuasion, ou va-t-elle, elle et les autres, avec un désir certain dans un certain nombre d'espaces, demander un autre type de règles de jeu mondial? Alors, on a l'impression que c'est peut-être idéaliste. Je ne suis pas certain. L'Union européenne, quand elle a créé son espace, son premier article se dit de contourner, de tourner le dos à l'irrémédiabilité des conflits. Cela veut dire que la pensée politique nouvelle est là. La BCE s'est créée, un certain nombre d'instruments. On se pose même des questions sur comment avoir plus d'efficacité. Nous avons entendu nos amis de l'Asie de l'Est se poser la même question. Les Coréens dire que nous avons un poids économique, nous avons une progression, nous avons été traumatisés, mais maintenant, nous aspirons à une nouvelle philosophie des relations internationales. Nous pouvons constituer un modèle, et j'ai entendu mon ami Thierry de Montbrial intervenir pour dire oui, il y a des espaces, est-ce que nous ne pourrions pas? Les uns évoquaient les conférences sur des conflits du Moyen-Orient, les autres. Et donc finalement, on aboutit à ce débat. Et donc il y aurait deux tendances qui recoupent le réel. Maintenant, à nous de prendre la mesure de la seconde tendance, parce qu'elle est absolument incontournable. Elle est là. L'ALENA s'est créée, l'UE se crée, l'ASEAN s'est créé, et l'ensemble des espaces multilatéraux. Comment les affiner? Comment mieux percevoir les changements? Comment s'en rendre compte? Et comment anticiper? Il me semble, pour moi, que le débat de fond est là. L'immigration clandestine, les narcotrafiquants, les drogues, au niveau du Sahel, au niveau du Moyen-Orient. La réalité, c'est quoi? C'est qu'il n'y a pas d'interlocuteur de niveau qui puisse peser sur le sort de leur propre région. Ce qui n'est pas le cas de l'Asie. L'Asie, la plupart des pays ont un poids économique, ont un poids financier, ont une cohérence et ont une présence militaire. Ce qui n'est pas le cas au Sahel. Il y a carrément une faillite des États et le chiffre d'affaires des narcotrafiquants est 10 fois supérieur au budget des États. Alors, pour ne prendre que cet exemple, ou celui du Moyen-Orient, les interlocuteurs sont tellement faibles, tellement fragiles, ils sont encore en mutation, ils sont encore en devenir, le conflit les frappe au moment où ils évoluent encore. Ils ne sont pas... C'est le ventre mou de la planète. À un certain degré, l'Afrique aussi. Donc, quelle est leur capacité à venir peser sur les conflits qui les concernent? Soyons sérieux, soyons lucides, on le sait. Donc, voilà ce que recoupent les débats. Alors, est-ce que nous allons accélérer ces mouvements en toute lucidité ou est-ce que nous allons nous contenter d'échanger des débats superficiels? Non, au contraire, dans cet espace, j'ai entendu des interventions denses, extrêmement importantes, fondamentales, et il me semble que c'est cette trajectoire qu'il faut continuer à avoir, et merci.
Thank you. Jeffrey?
Yes, changing tack a little bit on Latin America. I certainly agree that Latin America deserves a great deal of attention. I think it deserves a great deal of attention in particular because it raises two very important questions about the sustainability of contemporary international economic integration, globalization, if you will. It's emblematic of these two problems. The first is the domestic political and social sustainability of globalization. This is a region that, in some sense, followed all the rules after the 1980s. And I think there is a very broad and deep perception in much of Latin America that despite having followed all the rules, there has been little payoff. That is, that the economic and social results of globalization have not been as expected, which has led to the rise of populism in many parts of the region. It raises real questions about the domestic political and social implications of globalization in countries in the emerging markets in the middle level of development, such as Latin America. And I don't think it's exclusively in Latin America. I think this is a broader question, not only in developing countries, but also in the industrialized world, is if the payoff is not felt, that is, if the benefits of globalization are not widely experienced by the population, is it politically and socially sustainable? I think that's a question that a lot of people in Latin America and other parts of the world are asking, and I think it's a very important question. The second has to do with the sustainability of a particular model of economic growth the world has experienced over the last 15 or 20 years, where you have a phalanx of countries whose engine of economic growth has been driven by exports to the consuming regions of Western Europe and North America, and then another part of the world, Latin America, whose engine of economic growth has been selling commodities to the major exporters. That model, both parts of that model, I think, have been called into question by the aftermath of the great financial crisis. Latin America is experiencing the backwash of the end of the commodity boom. I think the world in general has to be thinking about whether the pattern of economic growth that sustained to some extent us over the last 15 years is sustainable going forward. So I think Latin America is crucially important because it is emblematic both of the potential for the domestic conflicts over globalization and potential for the questions being raised about the pattern of economic growth internationally that might not be sustainable going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais m'exprimer en français également. Bon, nous savons tous qu'avec la mondialisation, la planète est devenue un petit village et avec la création des grandes entités régionales, il y a un retour aux spécificités culturelles et tribales. Ma question est la suivante. Dans quelle mesure ce retour aux spécificités culturelles et tribales n'est pas en train, suite à l'affaiblissement du centralisme jacobin dans les États, menacer les frontières qui sont héritées du colonialisme ou de certains traités dans le monde, et notamment au Moyen-Orient en ce qui concerne Sykes-Picot. Est-ce qu'il y a une menace des frontières dans la mesure où il y a une resurgence des conflits dus aux spécificités culturelles et tribales?
Does someone on the panel wants to tackle that question? Mohamed? First, Gabriel. Okay, you start and then you. Please, allez-y.
Oui, merci. Non, assez rapidement, c'est une question complexe. Ceci étant dit, historiquement, la fracturation et les changements de frontières ont souvent été évoqués lors de compétitions entre puissances. Les antagonismes locaux ont certes pesé, mais pas de façon déterminante. Et il me semble que nous y sommes encore, ça c'est le premier aspect. Le second aspect, il est évident, comme vous l'avez dit, que la planète devient un premier village, à l'intérieur même des espaces internes. Lorsque le monde rural prend d'assaut les banlieues, comme beaucoup de pays du tiers-monde, c'est aussi le brassage et qu'il faut trouver des solutions pour les mises en cohérence, qui s'appellent une bonne gestion urbaine, qui s'appellent de bonne gestion économique, qui s'appellent est-ce que tous les instruments sont là. De la même façon que nous évoquons cette problématique dans les espaces internes, il faut maintenant définitivement se rendre compte que cette dynamique qui n'était qu'interne devient internationale. Elle pose des problèmes. La seule chose, c'est que les instrumentations internes, selon les espaces, ont été plus ou moins élaborées, mais sur la relation internationale, les instrumentations ne sont pas aussi affinées. Et on est passé du G7 au G8, au G20, et maintenant, on passe, on est tenu à autre chose. L'ONU, 4 des détenteurs de sièges permanents ne représentent que 10% de la population mondiale. Non, le fait est que nous devons nous rendre compte que ces mises en cohérence nécessitent de nouveaux instruments. Et donc, nous sommes confrontés à une nouvelle instrumentation, mais à la définition qui ne sera pas facile. Quelles sont les nouvelles philosophies politiques? Est-ce que c'est la confrontation? Est-ce, comme disait Gustave Le Bon, le monde actuellement est un monde de fer où seuls les plus forts résistent. Je ne crois pas, parce que derrière ce qui peut apparaître comme force, nous voyons des tissus sociaux devenir précaires, se délabrer, et donc il y a d'autres problématiques, d'autres raisonnements. Bon, donc la conclusion, c'est qu'effectivement, sur les pratiques internationales, le changement de frontières, la fracture peut être une tentation, mais souvent liée aux compétitions internationales. L'usage même de comment utiliser, instrumentaliser des frustrations et les gérer aussi est, j'allais dire, est presque une règle dans l'espace international. Est-ce que le débat de l'éthique se pose ou non? Est-ce que c'est un débat gratuit d'idéalistes? Bon, en tous les cas, il est dans tous les discours politiques. Il a été dans les élections américaines avec Obama, qui a suggéré notre vision à notre multilatéralisme. Il a été dans le discours des grands politiciens européens. Est-ce qu'il le serait encore chez nous?
Liu Shen.
Thank you, Dominic. And also, yeah, the cultural diversity is a major concern, primarily for developing countries like China, Middle East countries, and so on, in particular under the impetus of globalization. Many critics have argued, for instance, MacBride report, which is entitled One World, Many Voices in the 1970s, and to year 2000, British International Communication Corporation published a report which was a survey covering 10 years from the 1980s to the 1990s. It's about the British television media, including BBC, Channel 4, ITV, and so on, its coverage of the developing countries. And to more recently, in year 2007, MIT published a survey also about whether or not developing countries have been given more or less space to define themselves. Well, the result seems not very positive. On the one hand, the coverage of the developing countries from the first world, either in terms of quality or in terms of quantity, have been dramatically declined. It means through the media in the first country, people in the first country, it is virtually important for people living in the first country to develop an understanding of people in the third world. Also, since the 1970s, developing countries has been given much less space to define their policies, to present and represent their images for the rest of the world to see. So the cultural diversity is also a major concern for China. Now, as I have mentioned, yeah, scope for cooperation is unlimited. It's good for future, both for developing countries and developed countries. But we need strategy, we need wisdom, and we need belief. The point is, developing countries have now are trying to voice louder for the world. For instance, the English news channel in China, CCTV News, the slogan of the TV station is "Your link to Asia." Also, Al Jazeera English is going to set new news agenda. So all of these efforts should be seen by the world. And also, I think it's good for us to protect the cultural diversities because I remember President de Gaulle, he once said, how you can govern a country which has 246 varieties of cheese. So it's not good news for me if someday there was only one variety of cheese. So let's try our best to protect the cultural diversity. And also, that is why we come here and we have WPC. Thank you.
I must protest. It's much more number of cheese than the number you gave.
Exactly.
Toby.
I may just quickly add about the weakening of state values in the Middle East. To me, it has got to do a lot with what's happening in the social media. If you look at the empowerment of people in those regions and the number of users, there's a high percentage of people in the Middle East who are using internet. And I strongly suspect that this is changing the way they are going to look at how they are going to be governed. They have more choices.
The last question will be to Jean-Claude Trichet.
Thank you very much indeed. We are in the World Policy Conference, and global governance has dramatically changed because of the great financial crisis. The advanced economy were claiming that they had some kind of monopoly of the informal global governance through the G7. In economic and financial areas, you could say it was really the G7, not necessarily the G8. Now, in the occasion of the crisis, the baton was transmitted to the G20. In a way, it's a revolution in global governance. And before this period, we were in such meetings claiming for the G7 to abuse of its position, and we were claiming that the global governance, informal global governance, should be much more inclusive. So now we have the G20, which claims to have the exclusivity of informal global governance, and the G7 said themselves, we pass the baton to the, so there is no dispute, we are supposed to have a global governance much more inclusive. Of course, we can look at it with Jeff agreed either in being pessimistic on the performance of the G20, or being realistic, if I understand, or being in a position of guarded optimism. I would be in the camp of guarded optimism personally, but I would like very much to have the sentiment of the panelists.
So I take the last question. You have to be short.
Actually, I have 5 short questions to Mr. Mohammed. First question is, what's the impact of declining oil revenues on Algiers? Second, you being a youth minister, can you explain what makes some young people from North Africa join Daesh and become radicalized? Third question, do you think North Africa will go the way of Tunisia or the way of Libya? Fourth question, do you think there will be a power vacuum after Bouteflika? And there is a plan, can you tell us about it? And the last question I have, do you think the way Algiers dealt with the Islamic movement a few years ago has to do with its stability right now, and what can we learn from that? Thank you.
Well, you caught me by surprise. So, Jeffrey, would you like to
yes,
start with
as
the question
usual,
of
Mr.
Jean-Claude
Trichet.
Trichet? And Mohamed, you will have really something, but I know you can do it. You will have 1 minute to answer 5 questions.
Mr. Trichet, as usual, has I think, focused on one of the crucial questions. I think that there has been a real extension or expansion of what you might think of, or what's sometimes called the management group, the relevant actors in the whatever you'd like to call it. Let's call it global governance, if you like. I think of as international cooperation over macroeconomic and other economic policies. The G20 is a real thing. I think the expansion has been real. It ebbs and flows along with the necessities of the hour. I think that it will face some real challenges, because throughout the G20, the crisis has led to increasing what in the financial realm is the renationalization of finance, and increasing focus on domestic economic problems. At the same time as there are major tensions developing with the now rebirth of the surpluses in some of the major nations in the G20. So I think the G20 has functioned well. The expansion from G7 to G20 has been, I think, not even a guarded, but a real success. But it will face some very, very serious challenges. I see little indication, just to be a little provocative perhaps, little indication that the major surplus countries have effectively confronted their responsibilities in trying to rebalance the international economy in the aftermath of the crisis. And that, I think, is an essential component part of trying to rebuild the functioning international economy. We have country after country trying to depreciate their currencies. Not all currencies can depreciate against all other currencies. And so there has to, I mean, the outcome we would hope for is some cooperative measures to lead to a more effective rebalancing at the macroeconomic level as we move towards the post-crisis period. There are optimistic signs because the G20 continues to move forward, but I think there are substantial tensions that we will confront over the next 5 to 10 years.
Carlos, briefly.
Yes, absolutely the right decision on the G20. The amount of bad blood that we would have had if this had not been an inclusive decision would have been tremendous, and very much linked, I think, both the issue of governance and globalization to both of Professor Friedman's previous points. I think something to look into.
Mohamed, vous avez un défi extraordinaire, mais je sais que vous en êtes capable.
Merci.
5 questions en moins d'1 minute.
Exact. Exact. Non, c'est vrai que c'est des questions extrêmement complexes. Ce dont on peut retenir, c'est un certain nombre d'axes fondamentaux. Comme toutes les questions complexes, elles se croisent et elles sont contradictoires. Exemple. Souvent, quand nous écoutons les espaces, notamment occidentaux, sur ce qu'on appelle les printemps arabes, il y a une vision, et surtout dans les grands médias, c'est une vision très simple, très rapide. On va au supermarché, on achète un paquet sur une qualité moyenne parce qu'on paye un prix moyen et on repart. Et après, on n'est pas satisfait de ce qui nous est proposé. Une image pour dire qu'en réalité, nous estimons que c'est plus complexe, mais globalement, 2 ou 3 paramètres interviennent. Une insuffisance de gérance, de gouvernance. Il est clair, quand on compare entre les pays, notamment arabes, et l'Asie, la définition des priorités par les politiques, pour l'Asie, c'est la maîtrise du savoir, c'est la capacité de devenir un pays producteur de technologie, c'est de pouvoir faire face à son opinion. Et ces éléments ont pu constituer, dans le réel de ce qu'on appelle la démocratie, un ensemble de légitimité. Parce que si on ne perçoit la démocratie que comme une mécanique de votation qui serait une espèce de vitrine de séduction de l'espace international ou d'Occident, on tape à côté. Nous avons eu des pays qui ont eu ce type de politique, je ne veux pas les citer, sur 30 ou 40 ans, et ce sont parmi les pays qui ont le mieux et le plus fourni d'intégrisme musulman. Bon, mais le deuxième élément, le deuxième axe, au-delà de la gouvernance, au-delà des contradictions internes, et aussi au-delà des évolutions, parce que sur le plan strictement mécanique, les gens omettent des éléments objectifs. Je vous donne des exemples. Vous avez un pays qui a éventuellement 75% de jeunes de moins de 22 ans. Quand vous êtes déjà dans une salle et que vous êtes pédagogue et vous êtes enseignant, il vous faut une capacité d'encadrement. C'est-à-dire dépasser les proportions, la capacité d'encadrement s'amenuise et descend. Cela veut dire que c'est des pays qui n'ont pas toujours eu l'expertise. Donc il y a un aspect objectif de très mauvaise gouvernance politique, de très mauvaise définition des priorités, incontestablement des ingérences internes et des compétitions internationales autour de questions qui dépassent les pays en eux-mêmes, des questions pétrolières, des questions de géostratégie. Soyons lucides, maintenant la population mondiale, on ne peut plus la nourrir de débats courts, de schémas rapides, ça ne marche plus. Et comme nous venons de le dire, de situations aussi objectives. Alors, la fascination d'un certain nombre de jeunes vers la violence que nous avons, qui a été évoquée en Amérique latine, les violences urbaines, pour réduire les frustrations ou essayer de s'insérer dans l'amélioration des revenus, et donc à cause de comportements de villes qui sont accrus de façon gigantesque et rapide, quand on l'analyse de plus près, c'est le même, sauf que ici, la fascination est un type de violence urbaine, et l'autre, la fascination, est autour de frustrations qu'on imagine politiques ou religieuses. Et donc ce mouvement de jeunes, ce mouvement de violence est dû bien sûr à cet élément de mauvaise gestion, et aux pertes de référents, mais soyons aussi sages, lucides et un peu transparents. Le terrorisme a été un élément qui historiquement a été utilisé contre les nationalismes arabes, contre Nasser. Il a été utilisé à bon escient en Afghanistan, mais comment encadrer et quels sont ses impacts et ses retombées. Il est aussi utilisé par les uns et par les autres au Moyen-Orient. Alors, quelle est la part des tissus locaux? Je l'ai dit, je voudrais dire qu'elle existe, mais qu'elle n'est pas aussi fondamentale et importante qu'on le dit. Bref, est-ce que nous serions plutôt le modèle libyen? Nous avons passé le cap puisque nous sommes les premiers à avoir eu cet espace de violence et d'intégrisme. Est-ce que nous serions le modèle tunisien? J'ose espérer pour mes frères tunisiens qu'il ne se contentera pas de la mécanique de type électoral, parce que les éléments existent de contradictions sociales très fortes, des gens qui ont une vision rigoriste, d'autres qui ont une vision fermée. On l'a déjà entendu sur ce panel, nous ne sommes pas d'accord sur la gestion des relations internationales. Les uns croient plus au conflit, à la confrontation, et les autres sont plus des pessimismes mesurés. Alors imaginez dans des sociétés frustrées et qui ont un niveau d'espace de maturité T, quels sont les choix. Donc, vous le savez tous, le débat est certainement plus complexe. Ce qui est essentiel, c'est la définition des priorités. C'est pour ça, j'estime pour ma part, et je reviens, nous avons maintenant des problèmes communs qu'on entend régionaux ou qu'on entend d'une autre manière. Le terrorisme est un espace commun, l'emploi et la démographie, l'immigration clandestine est un espace commun. Il faut que les instruments de gouvernance mondiale ou régionale s'y investissent. Nous ne pouvons plus continuer au même titre de l'environnement ou des autres de cette façon. Le dernier point, est-ce que le départ ou la disparition de Bouteflika peut constituer? Alors là, vous aussi, comme moi, il y a des indicateurs. Le président algérien a eu des moments en termes de maladies extrêmement graves. Il s'est retrouvé dans une situation, un moment de coma, une situation de... La mécanique institutionnelle algérienne a continué à fonctionner. Moi, je suis convaincu d'une chose, c'est que c'est un espace qui a créé des compromis, qui a su intégrer la mouvance de conservatisme, d'islamisme dans le jeu parlementaire, qui a su intégrer, trouver des espaces de compromis. Est-ce qu'ils dureront? Si on imagine, si on analyse les tendances, il y a certitude que oui. L'avantage, c'est que l'Algérie a une capacité d'autofinancement de son économie. Elle est en train de structurer son territoire. Et je voudrais terminer sur ce point, parce qu'il est, à mon sens, fondamental. On n'en a pas suffisamment parlé. Il y a des choix économiques qu'on a suggérés. Moi, je me souviens que, notamment, mes amis de Côte d'Ivoire étaient désignés comme le modèle du FMI. On sait ce qu'il en est advenu sur un autre titre, l'Irlande. Mais le choix engage à développer les zones utiles. Mais on oublie qu'il y a un tissu social, lui, qui risque d'être fragile, précaire, et qui peut développer ce que vous avez évoqué, la fascination de la violence et la gestion de la frustration. L'Allemagne, les États-Unis, notamment le Japon et autres, ont développé leur territoire grâce à une structuration, leur économie grâce à une structuration du territoire. Et j'allais dire que la différence qui a fait que l'Algérie a pu être stable, c'est tout simplement sur cet aspect-là, de gros investissements, une réduction des écarts. Maintenant, l'appréciation sur les avancées d'un pays que l'on connaît bien, que l'on connaît moins, qui n'a pas de vitrine touristique, qui n'a pas un management de l'image performant, ça, je vous laisse le soin. Chacun est libre après d'apprécier. Mais
je crois que nous allons en rester là.
C'est de revenir sur les éléments objectifs d'appréciation de l'ensemble de ces pays.
Mohamed, merci beaucoup. Vous avez presque fait face au défi. Well, I think we'll have to end. It's 8 minutes past 5. We started 15 minutes late. But we are ending nearly on time. This is the first time we went to Asia. We were fewer as a result of that, but we were definitely energized by the environment in which this World Policy Conference took place. It was one of the most dynamic, most condensed most interesting by far. I want to thank you all for having contributed to this concluding panel. And thank you.
Don't worry, I'm not going to say that I'm going to speak 1 minute. That's always very dangerous. Since I have spoken in English, or tried to speak in English almost every time I took the floor since Monday morning, I will end in French. And it seems to me that most people in this room, who are remaining in the room, are French speakers. Donc ma tâche maintenant est très simple, c'est de vous remercier toutes et tous et de remercier particulièrement celles et ceux qui ont contribué au succès de cette 7e édition de la WPC. Je voudrais commencer par nos amis coréens. Il y a peut-être eu moins de participants européens, mais il y a eu beaucoup de personnalités coréennes en particulier qui ont circulé pendant ces 3 derniers jours. Et je voudrais donc commencer par les remercier. Il n'y en a pas d'ailleurs, je crois, ou très peu, à part l'ambassadeur homme qui répercutera mes paroles aux autres, mais dans un ordre qui n'est pas tout à fait arbitraire, je voudrais remercier Im Sung-jun, qui est intervenu plusieurs fois hier soir, un grand ami que j'ai connu quand il était président de la Korea Foundation. Et comme je l'ai dit hier, le projet même, avant la première édition de la WPC, et le projet d'y associer les Coréens a été conçu dès l'origine, c'est-à-dire au début de l'année 2008. Et nous devons beaucoup à l'ambassadeur Im Sung-jun. Il y a aussi des vieux amis, encore une fois, quand je dis vieux amis, c'est au sens friends of old standing, c'est-à-dire ce sont des vieux jeunes amis. Je pense à Han Sung-joo, que beaucoup d'entre nous connaissons depuis également très longtemps, une personnalité exceptionnelle, grand universitaire, grand diplomate également, qui a été très souvent avec nous, encore tout à l'heure, et qui a joué un rôle très important, ainsi que l'ancien Premier ministre Lee Hong-koo, qui a été notre orateur au déjeuner de lundi, qui a montré aussi beaucoup de sagesse et qui a parlé de la Corée dans une perspective historique. Je voudrais mentionner également l'ancien ministre Woo Myung-bak, qui a pris la parole aussi plusieurs fois, qui est intervenu hier dans la session sur l'Eurasie, une personnalité également très attachante, qui a représenté d'ailleurs la présidente Park à Monaco la dernière fois, je veux dire, donc il y a 1 an. Je voudrais remercier l'ambassadeur aussi Park In-kook, qui est le président de la Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. Et il y aurait tant d'autres noms à mentionner. J'ai remercié déjà plusieurs fois devant vous Eugene Roy, puisqu'il aime utiliser un prénom anglais, pardon. En français, c'est le roi, remarquez en anglais aussi, et qui a tout à l'heure été le modérateur aussi de la session ce matin avec Bob Gates. Je crois qu'il y a bien d'autres amis aussi coréens sans qui cette réunion n'aurait jamais pu se tenir. Et évidemment, je voudrais, l'ambassadeur homme aussi le fera pour moi, mais j'ai déjà fait j'ai eu ce matin Ju Shol-ki, le conseiller de la présidente pour les affaires internationales, à qui j'ai longuement parlé au téléphone ce matin aussi, pour le remercier, pour transmettre aussi ma reconnaissance à Madame Parguenier, Madame la présidente, et d'ailleurs à lui-même aussi, puisqu'il a fait une intervention de grande qualité sur la question de la réunification de la péninsule coréenne. Et j'espère que dans l'avenir, la WPC aura davantage encore, c'est le but, de participants asiatiques, et pas seulement, bien entendu, de la Corée, mais la Corée reste et restera dans nos cœurs. Alors, je voudrais remercier évidemment tous les nombreux intervenants. Je ne vais évidemment pas en citer la liste qui est imposante et importante, et j'ai le sentiment que la plupart de ces panels ont été extrêmement riches et qui nous ont permis aussi, même sur des sujets classiques, classiques pour nous, je veux dire comme le Moyen-Orient, l'Afrique, etc., d'avoir des perspectives un petit peu différentes, justement parce que nous avons ajouté la dimension asiatique. Donc tous soient chaleureusement merci, ainsi que les fidèles. J'ai souvent dit que la WPC devait être un club, et je pense qu'elle le devient effectivement de plus en plus. Mes remerciements vont à toutes celles et ceux qui m'ont entouré et qui m'entourent en permanence pour l'organisation de la WPC, et à commencer par Song Lim Kwon. Et je demande à Song Lim de monter un instant. Allez, de monter, voilà. Là, il faut retourner, voilà, là. Voilà. Allez, voilà. Et j'en profite pour dire que si elle n'était pas là, j'aurais omis de remercier également Yoon Byung-se, le ministre des Affaires étrangères, qui a joué un rôle aussi très très important dans la préparation de cette conférence, et dont vous avez pu apprécier d'ailleurs la qualité aussi intellectuelle lors du dîner qu'il nous a offert lundi soir. En tout cas, Song Lim, merci, et je crois que chacun sait ici quel est votre rôle en tant que directrice exécutive de la World Policy Conference. L'équipe qui nous entoure est très vaste. Vous n'avez peut-être, certains d'entre vous ont vu Nicolas de Germay qui soutient et le contrôle toutes les équipes techniques, logistiques, administratives, etc., ce qui est évidemment un travail considérable. Et je pense également qu'une fois de plus, Florent de Chanteyrac et ses équipes, donc il est ici présent derrière, Florent, vous pouvez même venir vous montrer. C'est un travail extraordinaire, qui est un travail aussi de nuit, et je peux vous dire que cette année, ça a été particulièrement compliqué parce que je pense que je ne ferai injure à personne en disant que le protocole coréen est particulièrement élaboré. Mais tout s'est admirablement passé, et les équipes de Florent ont travaillé jour et nuit pour arriver. Et d'ailleurs, dès que nous avons fini, tout va commencer à être démonté immédiatement, parce que la place doit être nette avant la fin de l'après-midi. Alors, je remercie également tous nos amis des médias qui ils ont été assez nombreux autour de nous, et dont certains ont déjà produit des choses sympathiques. Je pense que les seuls qu'on a mis sous mes yeux étaient des articles plutôt sympathiques. Alors, il y en a peut-être d'autres, peut-être que pour me ménager, on n'a pas... on a voulu me protéger, mais je vais quand même saluer évidemment le groupe Maekyoung, qui est notre principal partenaire médiatique coréen, et dont vous avez revu d'ailleurs le président, M. Chang Dae-won, qui a fait un remarquable aussi exposé tout à l'heure sur les big data. Et pour la France, notre principal partenaire est le groupe Les Échos, et avec la radio, ça s'appelle comment déjà? Pardon. Radio classique, ça me revient, voilà, c'est la fatigue. Radio classique et Nicolas Barré, qui a bien voulu venir ici, qui est très connu, en particulier en France, et qui a d'ailleurs modéré la session de tout à l'heure sur les big médias. Je crois qu'il faut également remercier les interprètes qui, comme toujours, ont fait un excellent travail. Sangnim, qui ai-je oublié? Alors, eh bien, je terminerai. D'abord, est-ce que parmi vous, il y en a qui pensent que j'ai injustement oublié de citer... bon, eh bien, écoutez, que ceux qui sont trop modestes pour signaler que j'ai omis de les remercier le soient, je veux dire remercier, et donc je terminerai en remerciant vous tous, illustres connus et inconnus, sans qui cet événement, ce club, cette conférence, tout simplement, ne pourrait pas exister ou surtout ne pourrait pas continuer. Et j'espère vous retrouver nombreux l'année prochaine. Merci. Ma minute a été à peu près de la longueur de celle de mon ami Mohamed Laïbouchi.